Well, thank you everybody for joining us on now day 4 of the 2021 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held during International Compost Awareness Week, which is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the compost industry. I'm Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I'd like to give a warm thank you to all of our amazing sponsors of this virtual summit. These include the Community Bank, Eco Products, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, Agrilab Technologies Inc, EcoPixel, Naturcycle, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the Eco-AmeriCorps program from the Department of Environmental Conservation. Before we get into today's program, I just have 2 other quick announcements. This week during VORS, we are also launching a multi-generational statewide art challenge called Changing Lives Through Compost, One Scrap at a Time. And we have a bunch of great partners who are working with us on this. This all stemmed from my friendship and working with CAV members Paul and Winsong Kervik to create a 2021 food scrap calendar that we called the Food Scrap Story, which featured photographs that they had taken over the years of the different interesting images that emerged in their countertop compost pail. Seeing this calendar on her grandmother's wall, 4-year-old Neoma wanted to do her own food scrap and yard waste composting, and that's here in this next to the calendar image. We just thought that was great, and we really thought that promoting this as a multi-generational initiative would be a nice way of sort of, compost is old food that's returning to new, and we're going to get kids working with seniors throughout the state, as well as others. And I also, just to show some different types of food scrap art, included 2 posters that UVM students did for International Compost Awareness Week in 2020. The theme for that year was Soil Loves Compost, and they created these really cool artwork made out of food scraps. So we hope you'll be able to join us in that. Feel free to reach out to me for more information or go to compostingvermont.org/food scrap art. So on to today's program. We're at the 10 a.m. session, Soil Builders, Compost-Based Best Management Practices for Erosion Prevention and Sediment Control. And then we have a couple other sessions later in the day. At 1 o'clock, we'll be talking about organics diversion options in Chittenden County. And at 3 p.m., the session is Zoning the Compost Entrepreneurs Challenge, and that's from the U.S. Composting Council. So I think all of these sessions will be really great. And then today's virtual tour, also at 3 p.m., is with Rich Earth Institute, looking at urine fertilizer in research and practice. And so that concludes the introduction part. I'm going to be doing the introduction for this one as well. This is actually part of a funded project of the Composting Association of Vermont called Soil Builders Education and Action. So today's session is focused on compost-based best management practices, or BMPs, for erosion prevention and sediment control. I'm joined by Mike Carignan from AgriSource, Jack Eaton from Filtrex Northeast Systems, and Heather Voisin from VTrans. Unfortunately, Chuck Duprey is not able to join us today, but I'm hoping to get him on camera and do a little, maybe a 10-minute recording after the summit to share some of what he wanted to share today. So just an overview of what we're going to be doing. I'm really hoping that this can be more workshop than webinar. So lots of participation from participants, questions, sharing your thoughts, concerns, experiences. I'm going to provide a little bit of overview of the Soil Builders Education and Action Program, and then just a short introduction to the compost-based practices that we're talking about today. We're going to look at, watch a 3-minute video of a CAV demonstration site that was done in Jamaica, Vermont, almost a decade ago now. And then we're going to also be hearing about some other projects in Vermont, talk about issues like sourcing material or with specifications, and how we think about phosphorus. So we're going to raise some issues that we've already identified in getting these BMPs worked into projects. But we also, just for those of us who have these conversations regularly, we also really just wanted to let you all listen in and ask your questions as we're having these conversations. So this is really going to be a dialogue. The goals for this workshop are to better understand the challenges for implementing these practices, and then hopefully identify next steps for collectively moving towards broader adoption of these practices, because this is something that we've been iterating on for years now, really. And it's, the Soil Builders Education and Action Program actually stemmed out of a 10-year-old project of the Compost Association of Vermont called Soils 101, I believe it was, which predates me a little bit. But there's, we're still having a lot of these conversations. So we're really trying to figure out how we can collectively move that needle and get some of these practices into action. Before we get into the content, I want to acknowledge my Soil Builders team, Athena Lee Bradley, who's a compost consultant and on the CAV board, Mark Companion from Lake Champlain Sea Grant, Chuck Duprey of Naturcycle, Brian Jerose, who's also on my board, the vice president of the board and president of Agrilab Technologies Inc., Deb Nair from UVM, and Ellie Ventura with Lamoille Regional Solid Waste Management. And it looks like it got cut off at the bottom there, but Ellie is also a board member. I'd like to give additional thanks to our guest panelists who have been joining us as we've been having these different educational opportunities, as well as a thanks to my board of directors who have given great oversight and input in the project along the way. I also want to acknowledge and thank the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission and the Lake Champlain Basin Program for funding this project through an education and outreach grant. So these Soil Builders workshops, what is this about? We really developed them to provide compost-related eco-literacy for Lake Champlain Basin decision makers, professionals, and advocates. And I'll just say that while our focus of this project is within the Lake Champlain Basin, these applications and these practices can be applied and are good in all different settings. So if you're joining us in the audience and you're not from the Lake Champlain Basin area, that's totally okay. And hopefully this information will still be useful and relevant to you. So what we're trying to do really is connect the dots between compost, organic matter, soil health, and water quality. We know that compost increases soil stability, fertility, water infiltration, and moisture retention. And using compost and land management practices is also a critical strategy for adapting to a changing climate. But there's a clear knowledge gap between understanding that there are these benefits and then from using compost, but then how do we modify the current practices to produce those benefits? Layered on top of this, concerns, very real concerns about elevated phosphorus levels in the Lake Champlain Basin and in a lot of other waterways. And this has contributed to confusion about when and how to use compost. So an important piece of addressing this gap is really helping people understand that not all composts are alike. They vary depending on the feedstocks that are used, the system that was used to make the compost, whether the compost is fully stable and mature or not. That has been an issue in some past projects that I know about. And then also particle size and the sort of that content, how woody or how coarse the material is or how fine it is. So I think a lot of people have in their head that compost is more like this dark, rich handful of compost here, really nutrient rich. You want to just put it in your fields or in your garden. And that is not necessarily the compost that we're going to be stuffing compost filter socks with. And I think that's part of the disconnect that people have. They just think that all compost is this really nutrient rich, dark material, and there's concerns about utilizing that near nutrient sensitive waterways. And we're going to be getting into this as we get into the content, but I really just wanted to make that point that there are different types of compost. And part of the best management practices and understanding best management practices is to use the right material for the right application to get the desired results. And our panelists will be talking a bit more about that. So how are we trying to move this forward? We've created different modules or webinars, workshops that are geared to help folks gain a deeper understanding of the connections between soil health and water quality, increase their technical know-how about compost, including the specific best management practices for a wide range of interventions, and learn how to support change of practice for road construction development projects, stormwater control, and site remediation, among others. And we're also doing deeper dives to get into some of these different topics as well. All of the webinars are being recorded and cataloged on the CAV website, along with the related resources. And for folks interested, we've done 3 of these already, and you can find them at compostingvermont.org/soil builders. I did want to highlight upcoming webinars here, mostly because I thought if we get into the content, I might forget to circle back to this. So our next webinar is going to be specifically on for landscape architects, compost specifications for landscape architects. Anyone can participate. That's coming up on May 20th with Chuck Duprey of Naturcycle. And he is a certified instructor, so we are able to offer lead and landscape architect continuing education credits. So next week we'll be launching the registration for that one. And then I wanted to just show sort of the variety of different additional deep dives or workshops that we're going to be having, most likely in the fall. So there's one, although some might be late spring, early summer. So we're going to be having an education and action for watershed groups. Then we're going to be talking about agricultural practices, top dressing for residential lawn care, a deep dive with Deb Nair into soil function. So going a bit deeper than our introductory module does. We're going to have a session for compost and engineered soil producers to start getting at some of those sourcing issues and the different types of compost that might be needed for these different applications. And then we're going to be doing a series of action advocacy workshops, and that really gets at how can we support change in practices. So moving into today, into today's topic, when we talk about erosion prevention and sediment control in broad terms, we're talking about managing runoff, managing or reducing runoff, and stabilizing drainage systems or slopes. But from a soil perspective, this really means how do we increase infiltration? So shifting the conversation from, oh my gosh, we have all this, huge volume of runoff leaving a site. How can we help that rain sink in and infiltrate where it falls as much as possible? Of course, depending on the slope, there is going to be some variation in that. But we're really talking about increasing infiltration rate, increasing the water holding capacity, and importantly, the revegetation or the vegetation rates. So as quickly and permanently as possible. So we're really trying to evolve this conversation. In the session description, we did link out to previous sessions that happened at summits last year and the year before, as well as these other soil builders. So we're not going to go into the same degree of background that we have in previous ones, because we're trying to get everybody on the same page and then move beyond that a little bit. But I did pull together just a bit of summary to start us off. So understanding soil properties is critical to understanding soil erosion and reducing soil loss. So these are just background concepts that all of this is based on. Soil can be a massive reservoir for moisture, carbon, and nutrients when in a native or restored condition, but it really can't retain water or nutrients when it's really degraded. And then use of local compost supports organic diversion from landfills and supports maintaining these materials as a resource for soil improvement and fertility. And that is an important piece, especially with Vermont's universal recycling law and the organics diversion mandate that we have in our state. But again, it's about using the right material for the right job. The 3 main practices or applications when we're talking about this from the compost-based product side are erosion control blankets or compost blankets, compost berms, which is actually down here at the bottom, an image of that, and filter socks, which is right here. And again, coarse material tends to be best for these specific types of applications. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Jamaica, Vermont demonstration site that was coordinated by the Composting Association of Vermont, Pat Sagui, the former director, back in 2012, post-Irene. So this was a project that used compost products to stabilize storm-damaged roadside banks. It was about a 6,000 square foot area of a side hill on Old Route 8, for those who are familiar with the Jamaica area. Seeded and netted compost blanket and compost filter socks were used. And the goals of this project were really to demonstrate that the compost-based best management practices would be able to remediate heavily eroded side hills and show the improvements in flood resiliency of fragile or depleted soils could avoid future catastrophic failure. So this is a picture of what it looked like beforehand. And now this is my cue to switch over what I'm sharing, and we're going to just watch that 3-minute video.
This is a about 6,000 square foot slope that sloughed off during Irene. The road was reconstructed, and now this summer we're coming back in and we're stabilizing the remaining slope. So we're looking to stabilize it and naturalize it faster than it would naturalize on its own.
Well, what happened with Irene is that the river would come down in a straight line and then try to make a corner. And when it hit that corner, it would begin to undermine the material that was there. In this case, there happened to be a road there. When we put the road back in, there was still a slide there that had to be dealt with. Material was coming into the road, and we could tell that year after year we have to be coming back here and removing material from the road, and it created a maintenance problem for us. A solution had to be found to keep that bank from eroding. We looked at a number of different products, and this product seemed to be the best solution.
We installed a sock along the top of the job, which will do two things. It will filter water coming onto the site, as well as divert a significant amount of water off the site. At the top of the slope, you also saw us putting in some Filtrex filter sock in a wall situation where we're using stakes and offsetting the socks to hold back the steeper portion of the wall where we're above 1-to-1. We're really probably half to 1 on most of that slope. The compost that is in the grow sock in the wall is a composted grow media. In this case, it's a wood fiber and horse manure compost that's been aged about 3 years. The seed and fertilizer are added to that. By stacking the socks and staking them in place, once they germinate, the grasses and vegetation in the sock will knit into the bank in the back and hold the wall there. We're using a compost stormwater blanket, which is a 2-inch layer of compost applied to the slope over a lockdown netting, which is a HDPE plastic netting applied to the slope first, and then the compost is blown onto it. The compost will actually knit up into that layer and act as kind of a geograde in the layer to hold the compost on the slope. Effectively, we're creating a living wall. We built walls very similar to that that are over 10 years old now and are holding up nicely.
All right. So as this predates me, and in talking with Jack and preparing for this session, Jack's with us today and was clearly involved in this. And so I know, Jack, that you mentioned that if you were to do this project today, you might do some things a little bit differently. And I was just wondering if you could maybe start off the conversation about this project.
Sure. First of all, you see a lot of HDPE plastic in this particular project. It was really what was available at the time. Currently, we would have done that with a wax cotton product in the sock, or we're working now with a new deconstructed wood fiber sock that we believe will be stronger. For a project like this, it would be perfectly adequate. Same thing with the netting we would use. We'd use a biodegradable netting. That netting is only there really until we get vegetation established on the slope. We used a horse manure. We actually took a horse manure compost and some bark mulch and mixed them together to make the media here, which isn't ideal. I'd rather go to Mike and have him supply me with something specific to the site, or someone to do specifically to the site. But certainly at the time, we were all focused on making a finished compost product. And I do want to emphasize that both in the sock and in the blanket, we're looking at a very coarse product compared with most of what people would use today. So in that blanket, I like to describe it as a 1" minus, or generally a 1" minus evenly graded compost. And it can go a little bit coarser than that. We actually want that material to be blown onto the slope and to lay down and kind of lay over itself. And that helps it hold it together while the vegetation starts to establish. Inside the socks, we're looking at a material that's even coarser than that. It's 2" minus with less than 40% fines, passing a 3/8 inch sieve. So this was all designed about utilizing compost overs as much as possible. So we want to finish compost, probably in the middle there, maybe a blanket material, some material that we could use in a sock, and a very small amount of material that either has to go back into the stream or be landfilled. That's probably the biggest things that we would have done differently here. I would have liked to have had more time to plan this. Demo projects always happen very quickly and with very limited resources. So, if this was designed through V-Trans, we probably would have done things a little bit differently than we did here, had a little bit more equipment, prepped the slope a little bit more than we had time to, but we did what we could under the circumstances. And for the most part, it's held up very nicely.
Great, thank you. And Mike, I don't know if you want to jump in or add anything about this project before we move on to some other sites?
The first time I saw the video about the project, so it's great to see how it works. But I think Jack, hits the nail on the head, is, knowing the size-wise of the compost that you're going to be using, especially on slopes where you need that coarser material to kind of hold together and stop some of the slide and the movement. So the coarser you have on some of those blanket materials, 1" or so, they can start intertwining and mingling to hold themselves in place. So you're not getting, it showed in the video, this is after a 2" rainstorm as well, and it seemed to be able to keep some of that slope side up there. So having the right material that's going to bind to that slope and really work within itself to hold together is really necessary in these kind of applications.
Great, thank you. And we did have a question from Christina, asks if short paper fiber could be used to stabilize slopes, or if either of you have ever used short paper fiber.
Mike, you want to handle that, or you want me to? I can give you a quick answer.
Yeah, we don't really handle short paper fiber. It's a heavier type of material, might be tough to put through the blower, but Jack, you can speak to that.
It's hard to get through a blower. Personally, I feel like it should be part of a feedstock rather than a finished product going under the slope. Yeah. Can I stabilize the slope with it? Yes. But we have the one thing that I really want to emphasize here is our end game is a vegetated slope. That's really what we're looking for in all of this. And it takes a short paper fiber slope much longer to vegetate than it would if we use a more refined compost product.
Great, thank you. We're going to move to more case studies. Jack has been involved in a handful of other projects in Vermont and New Hampshire and beyond, but we're looking at some sort of closer to home today.
Sure. And I apologize that I don't have any more mature pictures of this project than I do. This is a small project that Pat and I did on the shoreline of the White River in Sharon. And this was the first time we attempted using a biodegradable fabric in the sock with the compost. It worked out extremely well. The only thing I have to say about using biodegradables on shoreline projects is we need to be sure that our shear force, once the project is done, is going to be able to be handled by the vegetation, because the sock material obviously will be gone. You know, you'll get a year, possibly 2 years of protection with the sock, but after that it's going to be gone. So you just want to make sure your shear forces are going to be handled by the vegetation itself. We do other states where they've allowed us to use non-biodegradables, and just my take on biodegradables and non-biodegradables, I want either a biodegradable or I want a product that's probably never going to biodegrade. So once I'm done with it in the landscape, I can remove it and take all of that product away. You'll see this is the first 2 projects I did. I did a job in Barrie and I did this job in Killington. Again, HDPE plastics was all we had at the time. I would have done this in a biodegradable now that would, at the end of the project, be starting to break down and within a year or so be gone. All right. And either we can spread that material or it becomes part of the landscape.
Yeah, if I can
So
jump something on the other side of the composting side of it is,
Yeah.
you know, we get tons of calls of, hey, we have this sock, can we bring it to you since we're commercial composters? And then dealing with that material, if it's not a biodegradable or if it's going to be lasting, sometimes difficult for us to handle on that side of things. So if it is something that breaks down the landscape, Jack will know better on how well it works in actual installation. But just from the composting side of things, where some of these materials are coming out, it could be difficult to manage, you know, where it's going, you know, end use of that material. So just something we've seen over the years of, you know, some of those socks that don't break down. If it's, you know, you can take it, you can work the material on the inside, but it's labor intensive of, you know, cutting the socks open and taking them off. And sometimes, you know, we just can't handle the material. So I think there's a balancing act there too with, you know, what the material is.
I totally agree. And a lot of it depends on how long your project is going to last. If your project is going to be, in this case, it was they're repaving Route 4. They'd be there for the summer and they're going to be gone. Biodegradable to me is the answer here. If your project is going to last multiple seasons, maybe you want to consider using a non-biodegradable, but you definitely want it in your plan that that product is going to be removed at the end of the job. You also could use biodegradable on a multi-year project. You just should have something in your plans that says that after a season, going into the second season, that we're inspecting that and repairing any damage that needs to be replaced, because that product will start to biodegrade fairly rapidly.
Can I jump into like layer
Yeah.
another piece on top of this? We have been coordinating with folks from the Minnesota Department of Transportation as well. And another consideration that we're trying to put into the mix is looking at how much plastic we're using in our EPSC products. And so layered on top of all these different factors is a recognition that we need to be careful and mindful with how much plastic we're putting out there. And if it's going to then be removed, I think that's maybe not so much of an issue, but trying to be careful that we don't have, you know, I guess it depends what kind of biodegradable material it is, because a lot of times it still can be a plastic material that's billed as being biodegradable, but it breaks down and it puts microplastics into the environment. So all these different factors come into play. So I think it all comes down to just being like really careful and choosing, you know, the exact product that we want.
I totally agree with you. And we looked at this a lot, and I had to do some hand pounding at Filtrix, because they are a plastics company and they really wanted to, you know, do a biodegradable plastic or something along those lines. But you're exactly right. Whether it be photodegradable or biodegradable, plastic products break down into smaller pieces of plastic and they never go away. That's kind of a quote I took from a chemist friend of mine, who he doesn't see a problem with it. I see a much bigger problem with it. So we really are pushing some of our biodegradables. The issue with biodegradable products is the tensile strength, and trying to make sure we have tensile strength that's going to do the job that you want to do and last long enough. Interestingly enough, we did a job with wattle, but biodegradable wattle at the Elizabeth mine this past year. And they still wanted us to remove the fabric because there was fabric still showing at the top. The bottom was totally decomposed, but they wanted us to still pull the fabric. Very easy job because you could literally pick it up with your fingers and pull what was left away. But it's a real balancing act as to what we use in those fabrics, for sure.
We did have a comment and appreciation for Heather for bringing out the issue and concern about microplastics. And I have a question. Is it not possible to make the filter socks out of a totally compostable product, like made out of cornstarch or bagasse or something like that?
Currently, our best solution right now is a wax cotton. So we're using a wax cotton fabric. There are no plastics in it at all. It's not a plastic process. And we are now looking at a deconstructed wood fiber. So they're taking a wood fiber, cooking it down to the much, I guess, the way you would do a paper product, and then knitting a fabric out of that. And we're using that. That is in development right now. I don't have a lot of it in the field, but that's showing some real promise of having a little bit better tensile strength and more able to last, say, 2 seasons in New England.
Okay, that's perfect and perfect timing, because Josh Kelly just asked if anybody has a picture of a waxed cotton sock.
I do. Well, actually, the previous picture that we had of the job that we did in Sharon, that is a wax cotton sock.
This one right here.
Yep.
Oh,
That's a wax cotton sock right there. That's available in 8 and 12-inch sizes. So that's a 12-inch sock right there, which is typical for what we use here in New England. We make larger sizes of our non-biodegradable products, but really in a biodegradable 12 and 8 are really what we can handle tensile strength wise right now.
great. Thank you.
One question that I have is when we start talking about needing to go back and remove the compost sock material, and maybe we postpone this for a little bit later in the session, but I also just wonder about cost, or if either of you can give general terms and like what the cost is or what that adds to in terms of having to go back and then also be removing material.
So I don't know that I have a lot of data per se. I can tell you from doing it and comparing it to the alternative in most cases that we've done work, which would be silt fence and straw wattle. There is significantly less work involved with removing that. I don't like removing this HDPE plastic. So after that HDPE plastic has been in the field for a year or so, it's going to start to break down. It's going to photodegrade, which is again turning it into a whole lot of small pieces of plastic, which is very difficult to remove.
Sure.
If we're using our polypropylene sock that you find we're providing in some blowing applications now and on pallets, that product is a polypropylene that doesn't photodegrade for 10 years. So we can confidently know that we're going to be able to cut that sock and remove it. And I would love to tell you that I have a great way to recycle that sock, but I don't right now. I actually had a company in Vermont that was considering making track mats, and I was really hoping we were going to be able to work on that. But that project seems to be stalled right now. So we'll see what happens with that in the future. Yeah.
Well, the pandemic has stalled. I don't know if that's why, but the pandemic seems to have slowed or stalled a lot of projects recently. But that's interesting. And I think, it's also important to note that those silt fences are intended to be removed, and often they aren't. They just sort of get flattened out and covered over, and you see bits of them around as well. So
I've got a great picture of that in my other presentation of a piece of silt fence that's been there for 10 years. Not only was it still on the job, probably 10 years after the project was finished, but there were 3 or 4 trees there that were all wind dumped because they trenched for the silt fence
Oh,
and
no. Yeah.
caused all those trees to wind up. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of, again, when you talk overall cost, there's a lot of factors that are involved in this.
Yep. For sure.
Yeah, I would say I am certainly not about to swear that no V-Trans project has ever left silt fence out there, but we do try to make sure that we're going back when a project is complete. And that is absolutely one of the things that we will highlight, and we'll have a contractor to come back to remove silt fence. But I know that that doesn't happen on other private jobs with the same amount of careful oversight. And I don't have a cost associated with coming back to remove some of those items because it's all integrated into an overall cost. But you can definitely see that it's not high on the priority list for contractors to come back because they've probably already been paid for installing the silt fence or the erosion log. But we do require that they come back and remove those things. In the case of an erosion log, what we have traditionally said is that if it's made out of a natural material, then it can be left in place. But if it is not, then it should be removed.
I can tell you, if this is any consolation, 20 years ago when I started doing this and I talked about removing silt fence, people looked at me like I had 3 heads. And that's not so much the case. I would put up a slide and the overall cost of silt fence, and it would include removal, and people's eyes would glaze over and stuff when we talked about it. But I think that's changed a lot now. And it's a much better situation than it used to be.
Great.
So you want to move on to this next slide, or?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on. And you said this was in New Hampshire, is that right?
This is in New Hampshire. If any of you vacation around Winnipesaukee, this is at the Lowe's in Guilford. So on your way out to the Weirs, if you want to take a project like I do, and wherever I go, I look at erosion control. So I've got pictures from Haiti of erosion in Haiti when I've been there. But at any rate, this is behind the Lowe's. This is kind of an interesting story in that this is a 2-to-1 hard clay slope. They were originally looking at putting this slope in, and actually they were going to put the building pad in first and then stabilize the slope afterwards. We did a whole mess of stuff with polyacrylamides and looking at how we were going to clean up the water. And in the end, we came up with a proposal where we said, look, they had a problem. They were concerned they weren't going to be able to stabilize the slope and get their pad built in time. What we came to them with was like, look, if you cut the slope and we are right behind you with a blower truck blowing the slope in with 2 inches of compost, you'll be able to cut time because you won't be putting loam on that slope. Then, we're turning 2 processes into 1. It took a lot of convincing that this was actually going to work. But this site that you see here has went through the Mother's Day flood, received almost 13 inches of rain in 36 hours. And we had 1 failure, about 6,000 or 7,000 square feet, I think, did slide off in a catastrophic failure. So if you look at this picture at the far end of this, we knew that we were going to get this storm. We didn't know how big it was going to be. So Friday, before the storm started, we blew about 6,000 to 7,000 square feet on this slope. And we did lose that in a catastrophic failure after about 9 inches of rain. So the whole thing just slid off. The rest of that slope had no problems at all. We didn't have any real issues. We had a little bit of slumping, but that netting underneath that's up in that blanket caught it. And it all vegetated extremely well. We picked up the compost that was on the ground, dried it out, mixed it with some new stuff, and put it back on the slope, and it all worked out fairly well. So this is one of the first real eye openers that it worked out very well. We did have a few issues non-related to the application. If you look right in the foreground of this picture, at the top of that slope, there's a snowmobile trail. And turns out that slope is a great hill climb in the wintertime. And we did have a little bit of repair to do after some snowmobile damage. But other than that, this came out really well. And this was literally just 2 inches of compost put over the clay. You could barely walk on that clay slope when we were applying the product.
Thank you. Any, Heather or Mike, any comments or questions on that? Or is there anything from the participants, Athena?
Jack, rooting into that heavy clay slope, the plants did pretty well.
Worked really well. So
Yeah.
this is something that, I know you do a lot of mixing applications, and I would encourage where you can, that we would mix some product into that as well. But in this case, with what they wanted to do, I chose some grass species that are going to be deep rooting grass species that are going to be fairly aggressive at that. Mm-hmm. And they powered their way right, for whatever reason, the compost starts to integrate with that clay fairly quickly, was what I found. And with the soil, with the roots driving down into it, seemed to work fairly well. And we really had no problems with that slope at all.
Yeah, I think another benefit when you're talking about coarseness of the compost, if you do have some of those spaces where some of that coarse material, wood material, is breaking down and working its way into the soil, eventually it's going to break down, right? It's going to get smaller and smaller. It's going to leave some spaces behind where you're going to catch some of that water that's going in. You're going to have space for those roots to dive in. So I could see the benefits of, adding that coarse material to help, aerates the soil a little bit, breaks it up as those roots are pushing further in.
I think I am a big proponent of coarser composts when we're doing any kind of stabilization. I think we're building soil structure by doing that, as opposed to using really fine product. I know for finished lawns, people like that. If you're going to do one on top dressing, we would want a fairly fine product for that. But when we're doing this kind of work, I want that structure to build into the slope.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot too, even just in soil blending and soil building, is it's not a bad thing to have coarse particles. You need some coarse particle sizes in there. And if you're going super fine all the time, you can start binding up what's going on in there and really start constricting some of those pore spaces. So I think that's something that aesthetically everybody likes to have, really nice, finely screened compost. And there's applications for it, absolutely. But then just understanding that coarse is not a bad thing in every application. So it's just something that I don't think gets brought up a ton in soils in general.
I have a question from Gary. He'd like to know if you recall the species mix and proportion. I'm assuming on the top dressing.
That is, well, on this application, so I like fescues. So I'm using some tall fescues. We're using, certainly I want some kind of clover, possibly multiple species. I like as many species as I can get to stabilize the slope. And now we're working. So let me just throw one more thing into the mix here as we're talking about this. These are all cool season grasses that we use to do these. They work really well on slopes. They establish very quickly. There's a lot of talk about using native species and pollinators and doing things like that. I'm getting a lot of questions about using pollinators in some of these solar farms that are popping up now. I would like pieces of those, but you need to understand that those species can take 2 to 3 years to establish themselves. And so we have to have a process that's going to hold up the slope. I want a nurse crop of grasses, and then I'll work on my, other stuff. Or I might do, so on this slope, we might have done, that terrace, we might have done with native species and leave the other slope. Or some stuff. So I've done some stuff where I'm using a small amount of cool season grasses with some natives, and then live staking. And you get a succession there that eventually you'll get what works best.
So it looks like there was some type of netting, or there was something that you're putting down over the top. Yes.
Yep.
This here.
Yep.
So again, this was a long time ago. The only thing I had available was a polypropylene netting. I can get that netting now in excuse me, originally that's a HDPE plastic netting. I can get that in polypropylene now, or I can get it in wax cotton, or
Okay.
hopefully soon in the newer fabric. Again, I think depending on what you want to use here, if I take that fabric and I bury it in compost and then I grow soil on top of it, that isn't going to photodegrade at all. So if it's covered by compost and soil, it's a very stable application. And there
Yep.
may be some places, if you get over 2 to 1 and above, I'd be very nervous about just using a biodegradable in that
Yeah.
situation, unless
And-
we were able to get some really good native deep-rooted species into that slope. But it is available in cotton.
Yeah, and then so, because that is 2-on-1 is getting pretty steep.
Yep.
And then was your seed, was that mixed in within the compost that was getting
So-
grown on the slope? Or did that
Ye-
come after?
No, that can all be incorporated into the slope. So we go at a very heavy rate with the seed.
Okay,
And we can go as high as 10 pounds per thousand, which sounds impressive, but when you look at your overall cost, sometimes that isn't that big a deal. When you're talking about blowing compost up there and all the other aspects to this, your seed cost is very low. And so we get seed. The interesting part about this is if you put 2 inches of compost on that slope and you have seed throughout that whole mix, and we actually would bucket mix it into the truck. What happens is all that seed germinates. Some of it doesn't survive, but it all puts out a preliminary root system and starts to hold that whole thing together. So the compost itself is starting to, the mycorrhiza and all in the compost has been in a pile sitting there, and all of a sudden you spread it on a slope and it just starts to go nuts because it's exposed to air and can really start to grow. So you get a lot of mycelial action out of the compost, you get root growth out of the seed, and it all knits together very quick.
yeah, that sounds great.
So we're going to return just a little bit to this question of phosphorus, because that is one of the issues of concern, primary issues of concern in the Lake Champlain Basin area, as well as a lot of other nutrient impaired waterways. And some of the things that we think about when we're talking about phosphorus loading is how phosphorus moves off the site. So it can move attached to soil particles and it can move in water. We also want to be thinking about the effect that increased infiltration rates and soil water holding capacity have on runoff volumes. So when we're talking about the stuff that's attached to the soil particles, certainly we're thinking about that bank stabilization or the soil stabilization like we've just been talking about, getting good root growth in there and healthier soil that can like just hold stuff in place. And even if some phosphorus may come out of that or other nutrients may come off of that in runoff, it'll be a lesser volume of runoff, because more can be held in place. And you also hopefully won't be having those huge slough offs of soil particles directly into a waterway, which then, brings all of that phosphorus that's attached to soil particles into a supersaturated situation. So that's one of the things. And then when we're thinking about also the increased infiltration rates and soil water holding capacity, I like to just remind folks that a 1% increase in organic matter in the top 6 inches can hold about 27,000 gallons of water per acre. So that's, you can add a little bit of organic matter and have this huge increase in infiltration and water holding capacity. So healthy soils can hold up to 20 times its weight in water. And it also just makes it more drought resistant. So that vegetation that we're trying to establish, even if we enter a period of drought, it's more likely going to survive through that drought if it's seeded, if it has a good medium that it's seeded and growing in because of the water that's held in that soil. So in terms of what forms of phosphorus we're looking at when we do analysis, there's a lot of talk now about, is it total P? But if we look at total P, what is actually, is that all going to leave? And it's more complex soil chemistry than just looking at a total number. And it can certainly depend on and vary depending on the other nutrients that are in the soil that might bind it, or the compost, organic matter, and the interaction of the soil biology on binding P. But we also look at this, and there's been a growing push to look at this water extractable P, or WEP, as an indication of what you might find in the water portion here, that as phosphorus might move off a site through water. Mike is going to lead us through this. He provided me with 4 different compost analysis, and we're actually going to be looking, I'm going to be pulling up, and we're going to be looking at the analysis sheet itself. One, to just help you guys, like see some people, like you're used to seeing this information presented in slides perhaps, but you've never actually seen, like, what does this look like? What am I looking for when I have this report? And so I'm going to just pull up the PDFs of these. It'll also be hopefully easier for you to see them because they'll be larger. And I'm going to ask Mike to just let me know which of the different compost blends you'd like to look at first.
Sure, you can just start with the, right down the list that we have there. So Medway, leaf and yard waste compost.
This one?
Correct.
Okay, great.
So I think one of the important things that you touched on to begin with is talking about 2 different things. We're talking about physical soil moving off of a site, or the nutrients that are running through the soil profile and getting maybe into groundwater or eventually into another water system. So you get 2 different things that you're looking at, which kind of leads us to are we looking at total phosphorus? So what's actually sitting in the soil as like a phosphorus bank? Or are we looking at what's possible that could be leaching through or running through the soil? So that's where we've seen things where the push for looking at water extractable phosphorus has kind of grown. We started doing some of this testing in 2018. We started to see this idea popping up more, and we wanted to see, okay, what's actually water extractable? Because that's what's going to be leaching through, physically moving through the soil, say during a rain event or something similar to that. We're starting to see the push again, U.S. Compost Council, and we're on board with them to start adding this into some of the specifications that we're looking at. So, what is the total or water extractable phosphorus? So these are tests back from 2018. You would think that typically a leaf compost would have lower water extractable phosphorus. In general, it has a lower nutrient than, say, a manure compost or a biosolid compost. So when you're looking at something like this, you can compare between the 4. So this is a straight leaf and yard waste compost, composted together. And actually, Natasha, if you go up to the first page, so you can see in the columns, it'll give you the nutrient analysis, and you can see total phosphorus. So on the left-hand side, you'll see phosphorus, which is just under the carbon and nitrogen ratio. And you look towards the middle, will give us our total pounds per cubic yard. So overall, with a leaf compost, you're going to have less nutrients in general. So 2.35 pounds of total phosphorus per cubic yard. So now you slide down to that last page where we did the water extractable test. This is all run through Penn State. So the water extractable portion is 0.75 pounds per cubic yard. And as that breaks out, it's around 5% of the total phosphorus that's in there is actually water extractable. So that's what physically is going to be able to run through. The rest of it's going to be bound up in the soil and held in there. So you can compare this to, you can go to the Ipswich All Natural, which would be a leaf and yard waste that does have about 10% of a food waste product in it. So we can start on that first page. We're looking at total phosphorus. You have a higher amount because you get the food waste in there, 5.19 pounds per cubic yard. So you look at that middle column. But if you slide that down to the last page, we can see again. So now we're looking at about 0.27. We're looking around the same percentages of water extractable between the two. So even though it has a little food waste in it, it's not going to be much different than just the straight leaf and yard waste. Now you can go up and let's skip over to the Amerimac, please. So Amerimac is a biosolid compost, so solids from wastewater treatment. Biosolids in general have a higher organic percentage. They have higher nutrient percentages in it, so you're going to automatically assume it's going to be higher phosphorus in there. So total phosphorus again, 5.78, a little bit more than the obviously double of what the straight leaf and yard waste is, a little bit more than the one that has food waste in it. Now if you go down to the bottom, you can see water extractable. So we're looking at 0.65 or almost 20% water extractable versus 5% on the others. Seems to make sense more nutrients to begin with. But then you look, and we change it up, and you look at the IPSC biosolids. Similar, we'll start with the total phosphorus. Total phosphorus, 5.88, very similar. So similar total phosphorus amount with this material. But if we go down, we look at water extractable, so 0.5. So you're looking at about 10%. So you're about half of what it is. So you start wondering, okay, what's the difference between two different biosolids? So one of the big things could be, as we were talking about earlier, what are the feedstocks? What's going in there? What are we beginning with? So during the wastewater treatment process, a lot of these facilities have to do phosphorus removal themselves. How are they doing that? So in IPSC, they're using an aluminum or an alum to bind phosphorus before they can send the wastewater back out into the stream. Where at Merrimack, it's a biological system. So phosphorus binds to aluminum and phosphorus strong. So you can see that since there's more aluminum and phosphorus in the IPSC bio, the actual total water extractable phosphorus is less in that material versus one that doesn't have as high of a value. So as you were talking about different minerals and different nutrients combine these, more organic matter combined. So you can see the differences there. So in general, the thought's always been around 10% of total phosphorus is water extractable. We're seeing about that 5-ish% with leaf compost, anywhere up to 20%. Now this is just between leaf and biosolids. Manures are similar. There could be even higher manure just because they have less of, say, those binding nutrients in there. I just don't have any data on straight manure. So just something we've seen, something to keep an eye on, and helps for us to explain that, yes, there is phosphorus in here. You need phosphorus for plant growth and establishment. There is not as much of a water extractable or thought of leaching through. Concern that we usually think about more is the soil physically moving off the property. So the faster you can get that vegetation established, hold that slope in place, the less likely you are to have a large amount slide down and get into a water system versus the amount that's water extractable that could be running through. So something we've been looking at and seeing, and I think there's more of a push towards looking at water extractable going forward, at least concerning phosphorus.
Great, thank you. And we will be also including the PDFs of these compost analysis reports when we post the session. Mike's agreed to let you guys have them as a reference. And I think these are really important points in terms of understanding or having a deeper understanding, nurturing a deeper understanding of how nutrients move through an environment. Is it a supersaturated condition? Is it tied up with other nutrients or other minerals that are in the soil? What are the concerns at different sites, and how can we mitigate for those specific concerns? When we do the deeper dive into soil is going to be touching on some of this, but it's not as just sort of black and white as a total phosphorus number might indicate. But yeah, I'd like to open it up for Heather or Jack or anyone from the audience to either ask questions or to add to this.
Not totally, but a lot of the recommendations we use for fertilizers are based on mineral-based fertilizers using urea and all of that, which leaves a site very quickly through many ways. You can volatilize urea literally within 24 hours. You can lose half of your urea in that regard. So I think when we look at some of the compost that we use, we can be using a lot less of this nitrogen and phosphorus that we're worried about, and still getting the same results out of it, has been my experience. We have, in the beginning, we were using some traditional fertilizers, but now, for the most part, we're using either an organic fertilizer if we feel like we need one, or nothing at all. My goal is to try and use a compost that's going to supply everything I need to get that system going, and not add any kind of supplements to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's often overlooked is the biology within the compost that the compost brings, or that is found in healthy soil, and how that interacts with the different minerals and nutrients as well, and with the vegetation that's there. And so it's a much more complex system.
Yeah, the biology that you're starting with in the soil already, you're adding in this different biology with the compost. Now that can start almost mining nutrients that are bound up in the soil already. You might have, you know, a sustainable bank of nutrients in your soil. They're just not available. And there's ways that happens. And if you're adding some material to it, you'll see, you know, compost helps to, you know, jumpstart or start waking up what's going on in the soil. And it's almost starting to mine itself for what's existing in there, but also adding, you know, obviously more nutrients to the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Certainly here in New Hampshire, we have plenty of phosphorus in the soil. It's a matter of accessing that, if you will. So getting your pH right, getting the organic content right, and then we're not really adding any phosphorus at all.
Great, thank you. So we just have a couple slides left that we wanted to get into, and Heather's going to take the lead on this section and just share with us from the Department of Transportation, VTrans's point of view, like how do we start using this? So, you know, I think, you know, there's good evidence for the benefits and the multitude of benefits, this multi-value point that you get from creating healthier soil and utilizing compost and getting better vegetation rates. And it often seems that these applications are pulled on or called on when the standard operating procedures fail. and people are throwing up their hands and they've tried to stabilize a bank 5 times and nothing's working. And then compost comes in and there's a lot of case studies that support that in other states. There's a great one in Texas that's referenced on the CAV website, as well as many others. But I want to shift the conversation into like, how do we start bridging that gap between knowing that this is, you know, a viable approach and actually getting it, you know, whether it's into specs or pay items, or like, how do we, you know, is it a material availability issue, which it is often in many areas. So Heather, I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can walk us just through some of the slides that you provided.
Sure. So that perfectly mirrored the intro. I just wanted to say that the idea that compost is going to provide a benefit is not news. I think we've heard that repeatedly, but it doesn't mean that we've been able to make great progress in terms of incorporating it into our projects. And the reasons for that are probably a little bit of all of the above for what you were saying, Natasha. Mm-hmm. You know, it's definitely, there's a chicken and an egg issue here where, you know, you have the designer on the one side, the supplier on the other. And if the designers aren't calling for it, then the suppliers don't necessarily have a need to create the type of material that we're really looking for. Or, you know, we don't have applicators widely in Vermont that I know of yet that have the equipment necessary to blow compost on a slope to create that compost blanket. So I'm curious to talk to Jack a little bit more about their use of it in New Hampshire, and is there a way to grow that, sort of expand over into Vermont a little bit, and maybe that will help start some of that here in Vermont. The sort of flip side is that if the suppliers don't have it, then the designers aren't going to call for it. So all of a sudden we've landed in this situation where, you know, I don't know if I should say we're kind of pointing fingers at each other, but we're in this like cycle where we need to kind of break out of that. And one of the challenges working for a state agency, and VTrans in particular, is that our projects are very prescribed. So we have to explain exactly what we're calling for on a project. We have to lay out all the specifications that go with it. And right now, if we look at our specs, we have compost in our standard specifications. Right now, compost is only included as a material specification. So what that means is we don't have we call a pay item, where you would identify this is an item to use on your project and you're going to get paid. You know, for compost, it would probably be by the cubic yard to put into place. Instead, we have other items that we're calling for that might call to use compost. So that's where this list talks about, sod installations or amending topsoil, or putting it in erosion logs. We do mention that, or it's a component of landscape backfill. So it is used sometimes in our projects, but it's not called out on its own. One of the other downsides or missing pieces in our spec right now is that even in the material spec that we have, it talks about one type of compost only. I just pulled it up and I'm looking at it right now. And it says it needs to be loose and granular texture, which to me does not have those larger pieces that we would actually want in an EPSC type of scenario. So the way it's written right now in our specifications is much more of like that gardening type of application. So I think there's some work that we can do there to update our specifications. But we also want to make sure that if we're going to specify something, we don't want to end up in a situation where we put together a whole package or a whole project with all of the quantities and the pay items, put it out for bid, and have contractors then come back to us and say, I can't find this stuff. So that's, again, that chicken and egg issue. One of the things I did find was that it's not VTrans, but it's the, if you can go back just a second,
Oh, sure.
That's fine. The Agency of Natural Resources has their own set of standards and specifications for erosion prevention and sediment control. And I took a look at that to see what do they have for compost and compost items. And they do actually list compost as one of the types of materials that you can use for mulching. So again, stabilizing slopes. So that to me is a little bit promising. And maybe there's ways that we can adopt that a little bit more on the VTrans side. So that would be where you're using it more as like a stabilization measure, the compost blanket. And then if you want to switch over to the next slide, I was just going to highlight a photo just to demonstrate that, we are using RECP, stands for Rolled Erosion Control Product. So just standard practice on our projects, if you have any slope that is 1-on-3 or steeper, we're calling for having to use this type of more traditional erosion control blanket. So we use that a lot. And if there are opportunities there to incorporate compost as an alternative to that, I think it could have lots of benefits. Because there are many reasons why the compost blanket can outperform an erosion control blanket. You don't have to worry about having a perfectly smooth surface. It also, again, gets away from some of the concerns that you have with these type of erosion control blankets that you can see in this picture. In Vermont, and for VTrans, we have specified that they need to be all natural materials, but not everyone uses all natural materials in private projects, and that can be an issue for wildlife. So there are many reasons why being able to incorporate compost, I think, has some real promise, and hopefully we can find a way to break out of the chicken and egg cycle that we're sort of stuck in right now.
Great, thank you.
And if I could just add
Please.
quickly to this picture, and I don't know how old that picture is, at what stage that's at, but if that were in failure and we didn't have vegetation on that slope right now, blowing compost over that blanket would be a perfect way to repair that without going in and doing what we would traditionally do. I know at the Elizabeth Mine, one of the biggest things we did there was road repair. Prior to us blowing compost there, they would put an excavator back up on a slope when you're doing the Elizabeth mine is a capping project, so we can't have any rilling on the slope. So they would put an excavator up there, tear up 20 or 30,000 square feet, and we would start all over again. And by by blowing compost into it, we were able to significantly reduce our cost and get these, rills repaired. So that's an in to start, if you will, because it is a real chicken and the egg thing. You probably have more installers than either the installers realize or you realize right now. It's a different market for them. There are plenty of people out there blowing bark mulch right now. Many of those trucks are fully capable, if we design the material properly, to be able to do work like this. We might have to make some accommodations for them to get trucks out there. I know of 2 or 3 companies in New England that specifically have trucks that are designed to do this kind of work. They are very expensive. Okay. So they need a lot of work to keep them going. Maine, there's a company up in Maine that keeps 2 or 3 trucks going almost constantly, doing just this kind of work. There's another company, I believe, in Massachusetts that does the same kind of thing. So, that they're available, but it is, going to take some time to get things going.
Yeah. And I think that, we've had hydro seeding of slopes. We're a little bit slow to incorporate this, but we are incorporating it more and more. So I see this hopefully as following a similar path where, you might first need a larger contractor with more means and maybe some other experience outside of Vermont to come in and say, hey, we've had great success with this. Or they know a subcontractor who has the capacity and equipment to do it and can bring it in and then kind of introduce, more medium and smaller outfits to the benefits.
Yeah, to Jack's point, we work with a lot of landscapers who have bark blowers that they're using them in the spring to put their mulch out. They're always looking for something to do with those machines. Like you said, they're not cheap, so they want them to keep running. In compost, just top dressing of lawns has become a big thing, but being able to blow slopes and things like that, of course, there's different size machines that you need to get to certain areas, but there are more and more people who have these machines that are always looking for something to do with them. So I think it is an opportunity for some of those businesses in Vermont. Like Jack said, I know some in New Hampshire and on the Vermont border that do this, and they're always looking for new things to do. So, be happy to.
If you have projects, I'm sure between Mike and I, we can find you somebody to do it.
We know a couple people.
As does Chuck as well. And in that, the module 3 that we already did of the Soil Builders program, that was sort of more of the overview, like all the different types of compost-based applications. He did show like using a slinger truck and like a bunch of different equipment that could be used or modified to be pretty easily to be used for these types of applications.
So, yeah, I'm going to throw out there a good slinger operator could do a lot of slope in a real hurry. I think that's probably for large scale jobs. It does take a rather skilled operator to do it, but it's a very fast way to move a lot of material very quickly.
Athena, it looks like we might have a comment or question.
We have an appreciation for Heather from Josh Kelly. Great to have you at VTrans and working on this issue. And then a question from Brian. Are more demonstration projects a pathway to work through these barriers within state agencies, getting staff and contractors more familiar with the range of applications, methods, and products?
Yeah, I think that a demonstration project could certainly could help that. Absolutely. The trick is making sure that you have whoever's doing the application and the contractor is familiar with it, and you wouldn't want to end up with a contractor who doesn't know what they're doing. And I think though, if we had a demonstration, that would certainly help sort of show everyone, hopefully, hopefully it would go well. Sometimes we get a little too ambitious with our demonstrations, and if they don't always work, that doesn't help the cause. So.
No, I would agree with that. It should be a well-controlled demonstration that we knew what we were doing. And I love Jamaica. I've spent a lot of time in Jamaica at the state park there, and I know the area fairly well. But a lot of people don't know Jamaica very well, and that location is a little bit isolated. So something a little bit more visible might be a good project. If anybody's ever interested in going out to South Stratford to the mine, I can show you, a variety of different applications that we did there, both compost and otherwise. So.
Great. Assuming that at some point we'll be able to do tours again, Jack, maybe we'll tap you for next year's summit and have a field trip day where we come visit. People can come visit. And certainly in the interim, I was just thinking it would be great to work that in.
Yeah, we have another question from
Great.
Carol,
Mhm.
if that's all right.
Yeah, please.
Can this help shift using the wrong type of mulch over using compost with the larger, more coarse pieces? Because overuse of mulch seems to be a problem.
I've worked with several landscapers, actually using some of your material, Mike, on Fidelity. We've done a big project when the last landscaper was at Fidelity. We were using compost instead of mulch, and mulching beds, trying to encourage the plants that were there to overtake the beds rather than. So you're right. You're absolutely right. If we overuse mulches, we tend to, suppress some of the plant material that we have there. And I think using some of the composts that are available to do that mulching instead, it's slower. You want to change the whole way you go about doing it as far as cycling and all of that. But I think it has a lot of promise at certain sites for sure.
Yeah, we've seen lots of people switching over and using compost, and we'll see even using a chunkier compost. So it does have somewhat of that traditional mulch type of look to it, just for the aesthetics and just the value of the nutrients in your beds versus, if you have high carbon in mulch, carbon's going to pull nitrogen from the soil and kind of steal it from the plants. Whereas if you have a balanced compost with that balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio, you're starting to feed the soil and feed the plants. So there's more benefits than, just aesthetics and nutrients, but the water holding. It is a compost. It's something we always talk about. If a weed seed gets in there, it does want to grow. So there's a little bit more maintenance on that side, but the benefits of seeing what it does for your plants as far as blooms and vigor of the plants that are in there, that's a positive.
Great. Thank you. Anything else, Athena? We have time for one more if there is one.
Well, just a comment from John Culpepper over in New York State. This has been very informative. Those of us on the New York side of the lake have lots to learn from you folks.
Great. And this Soil Builders project is intended to be a Vermont, New York. We're trying to reach into New York primarily through Chuck Duprey's connections, as well as Quebec, right? So some of that sort of, cross-border network building and teamwork has been hampered a little bit by the pandemic, and but it's great, and we certainly invite anyone. We're going to be doing that whole series of the Soil Builder, more Soil Builders webinars as they come up, and they're certainly open to everybody. That is, I guess, the one silver lining of doing it through webinar or Zoom format as opposed to in person, is that it does open up possibility for more participation. So I'd like to just end the session with huge thank you to Jack, Mike, and Heather. I really appreciate your taking the time out of your schedules and sharing your expertise and your insights with us. I hope to keep you all engaged as the state tries to move forward with some of these applications. Thanks as well to all participants for taking the time this morning to share this session with us. I just want to give a reminder that at 1 p.m. we're going to have the Organics Diversion Options in Chittenden County session. And at 3 p.m. is the U.S. Composting Council's zoning session, the Compost Entrepreneurs Challenge. And we do have a virtual tour also at 3 p.m. for Rich Earth Institute. So we hope some of you or all of you will be able to continue sharing in this program with us. Everything will be recorded. So if you need to miss one, you'll be able to find it on the CAV website after the summit is through. And my final reminder is that all participants will be getting an email with a link to an online evaluation at the end of the week. And if you could just take a minute or two to fill that out, we really appreciate your feedback as always. And if you have something more you'd like to discuss, you can always reach out directly to me. And with that, I'll just say thank you again and close out the session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Great panel.
Thank you.